Hello, everybody. This is Jennifer Matarese, and before I get started on the episode today, I'd just like to take care of the usual housekeeping. For starters, paid requests are now reopened. If you are interested in submitting a disaster request, please double-check the list of requests I most recently posted to the podcast's Facebook and Tumblr accounts to make sure your request has not already been made. Also, please look through past episodes to verify I haven't already covered the disaster in question. To submit a request, you can send a donation of $30 or more to the podcast's PayPal at disasterarea@mail.com, on Venmo at Disaster Area Podcast, or on Cash App at Disaster Area Pod. Just add the names of the disaster to the notes on your donation. If you have an idea for an episode subject but you're not sure if it qualifies, feel free to message me and I can approve one way or another, although I usually do. This particular episode is a subject of my own choosing, not one that I chose because of recent events, just one that happened to coincide with recent events. If you'd still like to help support the podcast, you can do so with a one-time donation through PayPal, Venmo, or Cash App, or on a per-episode basis through Patreon at www.patreon.com/disasterareapodcast. A per-episode donation of even as little as $1 an episode can help me do things like pay the rent and keep the lights on. And if you do join the Patreon, you will get new episodes ad-free as soon as I record them, rather than waiting until they are released. So if you do become a patron, I would very much appreciate it. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook at Disaster Area Podcast, on Instagram at Disaster Area Pod, and on Tumblr at Disaster Area-podcast. Also, please think about rating and reviewing the podcast on whichever podcast app that you might listen to me on. And as always, the sources for each new episode can be found at disasterareapodcast.wordpress.com and in the episode description wherever you might be listening to me. The sources for this episode include the documentary Miracle on 4th Street, a report from the United States Secret Service using the shooter as part of a case study of the link between domestic violence and mass attacks, a timeline provided by the Washington Post, a YouTube video from KPRC2 in Houston, Texas, titled Sutherland Springs Shooter Recorded His Confession to Severe Beating of Stepson, and another YouTube video from Ken's 5 out of San Antonio entitled Victim Stories Heard through videos of Sutherland Springs church services. Sources also include I'm Not a Hero, man who shot and chased Texas church gunman shares his story from Time magazine. Texas church gunman lied about past to become a security guard record show, and conspiracy theorists harass Sutherland Springs churchgoers, pastor whose daughter was killed, from the Washington Post. From the first deadly shot until the last, how the Texas church shooting unfolded, from news.com.au. Comal County authorities didn't charge Sutherland Springs gunman with rape, even though the victim described brutal attack. And exclusive, guilt and grief overwhelm the mother-in-law of the Sutherland Springs gunman, from the San Antonio Express News. Texas massacre survivors say gunman, and then his name, became enraged by scared children during church shooting, from the New York Daily News. Site of deadliest church shooting in U.S. history is torn down over protests by some Texas families, and Air Force must pay more than $230 million in church shooting, from the Associated Press. And Texas church shooting video shows gunman's methodical attack, officials say, from the New York Times. As per usual with episodes about mass shootings, I will only use the name of the shooter once during the episode. For the rest of the episode, he will be referred to as the gunman, the shooter, the perpetrator, etc. There will be swearing in this episode as well, in multiple quotes from the shooter, so please keep that in mind if you are listening to this at work or in a place where children might hear. I will also be using alternate names for the gunman's 2 wives to respect their privacy given what they experienced at the hands of their husband. They do not deserve to be dragged into this, nor do his children, and so for that matter, none of their names will be shared. I will be sharing the names of the relatives of some of his second wife's family members, some of those family members, but not his wives and not his children. Also, given the events of this episode and the background of the shooter, I would like to issue a trigger warning for the deaths of children, domestic abuse against women and children, and mentions of sexual assault and rape against women, teenage girls, and girls. If you would prefer to skip this episode because of that, I completely understand. I would also like to thank the people who have been checking in on me while I have not been recording episodes. I have been working on episodes, but I have been a little preoccupied with maintaining my mental health and working. So thank you so much for checking in on me. I'm so sorry if I haven't gotten back to you yet, but I'm okay. It's actually my birthday today. It's the September 29th. So happy birthday to me. And with all of that taken care of, thank you very much for listening and welcome to Disaster Area. Episode 257, The Sutherland Springs Church Shooting, Part 2, November 5th, 2017. 27 deceased, 22 injured. When last we left First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, it was November 5th, 2017, at about 11:20 a.m., 11:30 a.m., give or take. And the interior of the church contained 26 dead bodies, 25 dead bodies, I should say. The 26th was an injured person who died in the hospital. But altogether, 27 people would lose their lives after the events of November 5th. The 26 people in the church and the shooter himself. Like I mentioned in the last episode, there were 49 people in that church, and pretty much every single person in there was either dead or injured when the shooter walked out. Of those who died, 12 were minors, and one was an unborn baby boy, Carlin, nicknamed Billy Bob, carried by victim Crystal Holcomb. I didn't see any sort of reference to how far along she was, but clearly far enough so that they knew the gender. I mean, they had a name. They had all of that. They knew it was a boy. So with all of that known, I'm sure she was pretty far along. Either way, that is someone who is counted as a victim in this particular tragedy. The youngest victim was her niece, 1-year-old Noah Holcomb, whose father, Mark, also died. Mark had brought Noah with him to church, and the two of them did not end up leaving that day. In fact, the Holcomb family was hit the hardest, losing patriarch Brian and his wife Carla, Crystal, and still gestating Carlin, 3 of her 5 children, Greg, Emily, and Megan. As I understand it, at least one of the other 2 children was injured. Then Mark and Noah. Carla Holcomb's body would be found at the front of the church, kneeling at the pulpit with her head resting against it as though kneeling in prayer. As I understand it, she was up there speaking about the events of the previous week when they had the fall festival, which is something that we'll talk about later. But the Fall Festival was something that they had done on October 31st. They had this big gathering and had lots of people, and I'm sure lots of, fall stuff and pumpkin stuff and all that. Dennis Johnson, who spoke in the video mentioned at the start of the episode about his path to the Lord, was found still holding the hand of his beloved wife Sarah, who had also passed away along with him. Peggy Warden had covered her teenage grandson Zachary with her own body to protect him. He survived, although not without a lot of physical therapy. He had some injuries to his leg. She did not. Joanne Ward died, as did her 2 daughters, Emily and Brooke. Tara McNulty passed away in front of her 2 injured children. November 5th was Robert and Karen Marshall's first day attending First Baptist, and their last. Military family, Robert and Shawnee Corrigan, both lost their lives as well. Many relatives and friends of those at First Baptist rushed to the church as soon as they heard what was happening. the daughter of Lula White. You had other people who were hearing helicopters and sirens and all of that, and they started realizing something is going on at the church, and they all start rushing there. Some would spot the cars of their loved ones parked nearby in the parking lot of the church, things like that. Haley Kruger's mom was directed along with others to the nearby community building, where they waited for hours to find out what the status of their loved ones was. It wasn't until midnight when Haley's mom, who lost Haley's father several years earlier, found out her daughter was one of the deceased. The thing about what damage that rifle may have done to people, it's entirely possible that, you had to figure out who everybody was from. I know with somebody it was tattoos. The first victim was identified by tattoos, that sort of thing. So officers had arrived and just immediately started, surrounding the building, making sure that people did not go in there, that sort of thing. So that's how you have like Haley Kruger's mom, other people who are arriving to look and see if their loved ones are still alive, directing them to the community building to wait so that they can make sure, what's going on in there and who's passed away and what bodies they have and all of that. Now, keep in mind, the people who had been injured during this, they had been trying to help one another. Julie Workman, who was the mom of Chris and Kyle, she was like going from person to person because she was injured, but she was a nurse. And so she's going from person to person trying to help. She was getting a little bit overwhelmed, obviously, with the situation. And there was another person there. I believe his name was Murcia or Garcia. His nickname was Gunny. He was a gunnery sergeant. And he was also injured, but he was kind of, cheering her on, basically going, you can do this. You've got work to do. Come on. You can do this. You can take care of this person and that person. And so when she was overwhelmed, he'd be, bucking her up, and she would take a deep breath and just keep going. There were others who were injured. I believe her sister, her daughter-in-law, Morgan, was injured, and she had an injury on her leg. And Kevin Jordan, who had left his house to come help in the immediate aftermath after the shooter had left, he goes over there and he's helping other people, and he kind of, I think he said he packed her wound, and then she immediately turned around to help other people. So the people who were injured and could still move and help out were all helping one another until more, people who were EMTs and first responders and all of that got there to start taking people by ambulance. The interior of First Baptist following the attack looked as though the only thing that would cleanse it would be a good strong fire. The initial gunfire from outside the church and the bullets fired inside the building pierced the walls and sent shards of wood flying all over the floor. Pews were knocked over, possibly to provide cover, possibly as first responders moved from one victim to another. Like I said, pews are heavy, so to knock them over, that was very impressive. I'm not exactly sure how heavy their pews were, but I know that the pew that my parents have is heavy. Bullet casings littered the ground like dropped Legos. They're everywhere. Some of you outside of the United States may hear the phrase "a good guy with a gun" and be confused as to why that doesn't include cops. That's not to say that cops are not good guys, although that's certainly a debate to have, and that's been had, and that American society continues to debate. But that's not what the phrase "a good guy with a gun" means in America. What it means isn't the armed patrol officer who first shows up on the scene to exchange fire, or the numerous other law enforcement officers who show up when there's an active shooter. It does not mean any of that. It means some regular guy with a concealed or open carry permit and at least one firearm on their person at all times. That's usually what it means. It's supposed to mean somebody who's not a cop. Somebody who is not doing this as a job. They are doing this because they want to protect people and they want to protect themselves. And so that's why they're carrying a gun with them everywhere. It could mean someone who doesn't go for all that permit nonsense and just always has a gun on them anyway. Or it could mean someone who has 57 firearms just for their family of 4 and takes Christmas photos with them, their spouse, and their 2 small children holding AR-15s in front of the tree on Christmas morning. welcome to America. You may have noticed that at the start of the episode, I said not that a good guy with a gun took the shooter down, but that his attack ended due to the participation of a good guy with a gun. Stephen Willeford was a person who everybody would hope would arrive to be the good guy. He wasn't a show-off or a braggart. He didn't treat his guns like toys rather than tools. He was an instructor who knew full well how to handle his weapons safely and economically. He struck the shooter twice, one a serious wound that made it underneath the armor covering his torso when he lifted his arm during the escape. He also hit the shooter in the leg as well. But neither of those shots would be what caused the death of the gunman. When police arrived and looked inside the silver SUV, they found the gunman dead with a gunshot, bullet wound to the head. He's fallen out, obviously, but he's, partially in there, and he's dead. And that bullet wound came from the shooter's own weapon, not from Stephen Willeford. This is not to take away from the heroism of both Willeford and Johnny Langendorf, who risked their lives in an attempt to stop the perpetrator from continuing to take innocent lives. They really put their safety on the line in a heartbeat. They did the heroic thing. And the thing to remember is that they dove in when they didn't have to. They did so in a way that, were they putting their lives on the line? They were actually putting other people's lives on the line, considering how fast they were driving, but also the way that it ended was probably the best any of this could have ended, in terms of the participation of a good guy with a gun. Probably, well, the second best. The best would have been if Stephen Willeford had seen him before he entered the church and stopped him then. By the time Willeford and the shooter first exchanged gunfire, 26 people in the church were already dead or approaching death, and 22 others had some sort of injuries. Everybody in that church had been harmed or killed by the time Stephen Willeford arrived on the scene. And that is not to knock his participation. It is not saying anything negative about his response. He did what you would hope a good guy with a gun would do in that scenario. The problem is that the person who had the gun had already committed a lot of destruction before he got there. And that's something that really needs to be focused on, just as much as the fact that Stephen Willeford and Johnny Langendorf did the right thing. They did the right thing, but there's still this tragedy, this horrific imagery that you're going to see when you walk in that church as a first responder. The shooter would soon be identified as 26-year-old Devin Patrick Kelly. In photos released to the media, the shooter looked slovenly and unkempt. Kind of receding hairline, short hair, patchy facial hair on a face rounded with extra weights. Right before the shooting, he shaved off his facial hair. But when he had it, I mean, I would not look at him and say that he looked like somebody who stays on a couch in his parents' basement and plays video games all day. But there are people who would say that, looking at the picture of him. The gunman grew up in what many would perceive as a good home. There's 3 kids, there's 2 loving parents, a strong faith. He grew up in Texas in New Braunfels, which, as I can tell from the map, doesn't seem to be that far away from Sutherland Springs. He was spending some time being homeschooled until 6th grade. The change didn't suit him, a kid known to have problems with authority and a short temper. But he found ways to join in. Taekwondo classes, junior ROTC, football. When he was in school, he did try to do what all of the other kids were doing, but he was also getting bullied. He was experiencing, dealing with other kids. He's a teenager at this point, so things are getting uncomfortable. There's fights and arguments and all of that. During his high school years, his predation and abusive treatment of girls began. According to a Secret Service report which analyzed the link between domestic violence and mass attacks, using this particular gunman as an example of that link. The future gunman preyed on multiple girls in high school and made mentions of possibly having obscene thoughts about his own sisters. I believe he told a couple of people that he had put like a camera in the bathroom so he could watch his sisters undress or something along those lines. But his father said, I never found a camera in the bathroom, which, he comes off in stories of, especially in that Secret Service report, which gets really in depth about all of the problems that he faced over the course of his life and the problems that he caused as well. And it makes a point of saying, this is somebody you don't trust, especially if you're a woman or a girl. Don't go anywhere near this guy. He is untrustworthy. He's he's violent, he is jealous. Like, there are so many things about this particular shooter that are a problem. If you get my meaning, they're all bad signs of what he could do in the future. As an older teen, he targeted adolescent girls, including one 13-year-old with a personal history of abuse, we will call Annie. Annie had been abused as a small child. She had been taken from her biological family and been adopted into another family. And so she had some serious problems, some mental health issues, I imagine, having dealt with that, maybe PTSD, that sort of thing. So that is the sort of person that he would target, the sort of girl that he would target, somebody who could be manipulated, if not outright forced into situations that I will refrain from describing. The Secret Service report being what it is, if you like looking through the sources and reading them, in this particular instance, I have to give a warning that report contains some pretty detailed descriptions of every sort of assault or whether it be sexual or physical, that he committed against women or girls that the Secret Service knew of. They put all of their information into that case study, and it's a lot. It is a lot of stuff. So I'm not really going to get into detail on that. But suffice it to say that if you were a girl or a young woman and you were in his sphere of, his circle, I guess, or anywhere near him, he would attempt something. The perpetrator would go on to finish high school, although not without getting in trouble and being suspended half a dozen times. He also got hit with a possession charge for marijuana, something that he wouldn't bother to disclose when he applied for the Air Force straight out of high school. When he was found out after his admission, he pointed the finger at the recruiter who signed him up. Yeah, that guy. He told me to lie. That one, right there. And I guess they sort of seemingly let it slide because he continued to keep going with the Air Force and serving and all of that. The future gunman began training as an intelligence analyst, a network intelligence analyst, but that didn't last long. He started out pretty good, as I understand it, but he failed at what he was being trained to do so badly that he was switched to, quote, traffic management, unquote, which I can only assume is exactly what it sounds like. But about a year after starting his service with the Air Force in 2016, the perpetrator hooked back up with a girl he knew when he was in high school. We'll call her Mary. By now, Mary had her own responsibilities in the form of an infant son who was about 6 or 7 months old. Within 2 months, they'd gotten hitched. They just, whirlwind relationship, they get married. Everything's great. No, it's not. A month after they were married, the future gunman showed Mary his true colors. That was the first time he choked her. He kept up his abuse, doing everything from kicking her to waterboarding her as though she were going into a torturous interrogation. He threatened both of his wives with waterboarding, and as far as I understand it, did do it to Mary. He didn't do it to his second wife, I don't think. But he did threaten that a lot. I'll waterboard you, which, okay. They'd moved to New Mexico, him and Mary, around the time of the wedding when the shooter was reassigned to a fort in that area. And this would have left Mary far from home with a baby to worry about. A baby whom, it would turn out, the shooter would soon harm as well. Work wasn't going any better than the marriage was, by the way. The guy who couldn't handle dealing with authority in high school made the mistake of joining the military, where you kind of don't have any choice whatsoever about whether you get to respect authority or not. If the gunman would get in trouble, or get called out on his many mistakes and lazy behavior, he would have what could politely be called a tantrum, screaming, crying, stomping his feet. It got to the point where his supervisor, or one of his supervisors, warned others to treat him with kid gloves. Be careful with him, she said. He might, quote, shoot the place up, unquote. She wasn't wrong for obvious reasons, but also because he said as much to Mary. Quote, my work is so lucky I do not have a shotgun, he told her, because I would go in there and I would shoot everyone. Close quote. He had several supervisors at the military base where they were staying and where he was working, and several of them seemed to be women. And so many of them, like multiple supervisors, he would go on to harass later on as well. It seemed like, like I said, if you were a woman who passed through his orbit, he grabbed onto you with some sort of mental tentacle and held on, and later on would go back and like text you and ask you for nudes or call you all kinds of names or sexually harass you. Like, there were so many things that he was doing to so many of the women in his orbit. At the end of May in 2011, Mary rushed her son to the emergency room. He was having a seizure. Days later, he was back with vomiting and diarrhea. A week later, he was back, vomiting once again, but disoriented and falling to the ground as well. He would have only been 10 months, so I'm assuming if he wasn't walking at that point, he was kind of just falling over, looking dizzy, that sort of thing. Sometime between his previous visit and this one, he'd gotten a handprint-shaped bruise on his face, a fractured clavicle, and a hemorrhage in his brain. He was only 10 months old. The military filed charges against the gunman for abusing his stepson, which he claimed he was innocent of, and that the 10-month-old had done to himself, with his enormous 10-month-old hands slapping him and leaving a hand-shaped bruise on his face, apparently. During the process of filing these charges, the military was supposed to submit his fingerprints to the FBI database, but did not. This, it would turn out, would be just one of several mistakes made by the military in their dealings with the shooter. After the little boy was removed from their custody, the gunman continued his attacks on Mary. He did what so many abusive partners do. He threatened her family and cut her off from them. He assaulted her and said it was her fault. He pushed her into a corner where she had nowhere to turn, because everywhere around her were walls that he had put up. In September of 2011, the shooter started what would end up being 6 months' worth of mental health counseling. He'd lost his stepson, that violent baby who wouldn't stop hurting himself, and his supervisors kept picking on him, according to him. The counselors diagnosed him with depression, anxiety, and antisocial personality disorder, along with several other symptoms which basically seemed to amount to being so incredibly angry all the time that he couldn't sleep or focus. All this time, he continued to threaten Mary. They started couples counseling at the start of 2012, but according to the Secret Service report, he told her before one of their sessions, quote, presumably in text, because that's the way that this is presented. Quote, you're 90% of the problem, and if you repeat what I say, I'll kill you and drag your dead body and desert it. Close quote. Close text, I guess. February 12th of that year was his 21st birthday, and he celebrated it the about the way you might expect, by assaulting Mary in their car when she mentioned divorce, and by buying himself a .38 special on the base where they lived and proceeding to carry it everywhere. Thankfully, at this point, Mary summoned the courage, not long after this, to leave. She reported him and his mistreatment of her to the military and went back to Texas and her family. In response, the shooter admitted himself to a non-military mental health facility for treatment, claiming suicidal ideation. He may have definitely had suicidal ideation. That's completely in line with his previous diagnosis. What he didn't mention, or seemingly didn't mention, was that he also carried homicidal ideation as well. In a journal, he wrote his jealous fantasies about Mary, saying, quote, "Unless she proves to me that she loves me, I'm going to do whatever it takes to destroy all of this. I'll play along and wait out my time here, but if things don't go as planned, I will kill myself because there is no way I can go back to a place like this or jail. I would rather die." Close quote. Later in the same entry, he said, quote, "I'm seriously going over it in my mind. What it would be like if I actually did suicide/homicide. I don't want to, but if this doesn't work out, I have no other alternative for myself. Until death do us part." Close quote. The shooter left the facility on March 8th when he was discharged, and unfortunately, Mary returned. She desperately wanted custody of her son, returned to her, and she probably felt like this was the only way. When you are in an abusive relationship like this, it is a struggle to, stay away and keep away. Someone like this is manipulative. They are going to threaten people, and you may believe that it is safer for everybody if you just go back to him and take the beatings. And that's unfortunate, but it's one of the problems with domestic violence and how victims respond to that. And that's not me victim blaming at all. It's just that going through all of that puts you in a very a headspace that everybody else is not going to be able to understand. And so it can get frustrating to read stories about people who are in abusive relationships and don't leave, or they come back. But the fact is that it's just a situation that you can't describe to other people the decisions that you make when it comes to staying or going or whatever it is that you do in response to being physically assaulted, sexually assaulted, emotionally assaulted, mentally assaulted, all of the things that Mary was going through. Soon enough, the shooter was back to his old tricks, loading a revolver, not the .38 special, which he turned over to the military earlier when the charges about his stepson had come up, then threatening to shoot himself, and then threatening to shoot Mary if she left him. Around this time, the shooter needed to take the domestic violence inventory short-form screen test for pre-sentencing for those charges for abusing his stepson. Unsurprisingly, the test said he was at maximum risk of committing violence and, quote, controlling behaviors in relationships, close quote, presumably in between incidents of threatening Mary with a gun or choking her. Now, that's from the Secret Service report. And all of this, while all of this was going on, he once again bought a weapon on base, this time a Sig Sauer P250 9mm semi-automatic weapon along with ammo. You would think that part of getting that sort of assessment on a domestic violence screening from a person would encourage the military to at least tell the base exchange as soon as possible, hey, maybe don't sell this guy a weapon. But apparently not. A week and a half later, he threatened Mary with a gun again. 2 months after leaving a mental health facility, the gunman was once again back in a mental health facility. On his intake forms, it was noted that he was, quote, violent, suicidal, and homicidal. Also in the intake forms was a note about him telling Mary he wanted to kill his supervisors at work. The shooter would be in the hospital for weeks, and soon enough was caught looking at, quote, websites related to firearms and body armor, per the Secret Service report. The very next day, the investigators looked into his spousal and child abuse charges. They got a call from the base exchange. Say, we just figured we should tell you that guy who beat his wife and keeps threatening people ordered a Diamondback D89 9mm semi-automatic handgun. He said he would be picking it up in a week. Is he supposed to do that? Not according to the team investigating his risk for violence, he wasn't. Well, not buying a gun at the moment, but definitely not picking it up in a week. He was supposed to be staying in the mental health facility until he could be moved into confinement for the criminal charges. Unsurprisingly, that night, he escaped from the mental health facility. The gunman didn't stick around, or at least he tried not to. He'd be found at a bus station the following day, about 12 miles away from the hospital. It was in El Paso, and he was arrested, warning the officers who arrested him that he'd try to grab one of their guns if he got a chance. He didn't, and the next day he got shunted out of the mental hospital and into pre-trial confinement. This time, the hospital found he also had, quote, attention deficit disorder and antisocial traits, close quotes. Later, during pretrial confinement, he also got diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. Now, I want to say something as someone who has mental health issues. For those of you who don't have them, you're neurotypical, you are perfectly fine. Having more than one isn't weird. Some of them pair together. Depression and anxiety is a big one, that kind of the two of them. You talk to somebody who has depression, they usually have anxiety too, and for extra fun, they pair up, but they also contrast each other, and it just can be a real pain in the butt. It is for me. I have those two that I've been diagnosed with, major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder, and for all I know, there might be another one in there. That's why I have a doctor and a therapist, so I can have them keep an eye on me and make sure that I'm not showing signs of, going downhill or other mental health disorders, mental health issues. They can identify that. But once you're starting to collect them like Pokemon cards, that's not good. That's not to say that these diagnoses were false. Plenty of people with mental health issues struggle with multiple disorders. But when you're starting to use a second hand to count them off, you're getting to a point where you're mentally juggling chainsaws on fire, and being released from care too soon or with not enough support can flow into very dangerous situations. The shooter's criminal charges from the military were going ahead full steam during all of this. The list of charges filed as part of the court-martial shows that the shooter faced one charge of choking, kicking, and pulling the hair of his wife Mary on several occasions, one charge of viciously assaulting his 10-month-old stepson around the head enough to cause grievous bodily harm, another similar charge for assaulting his stepson around the body, and a fourth charge on pointing a loaded gun at Mary. He pled guilty to the first two charges, while the third and fourth charges, including the one about pointing a loaded weapon at his wife, were, quote, withdrawn and dismissed with prejudice after arraignment, according to the documentation. In response to the charges he faced, the shooter had made a video of himself, confessing to what he did to his stepson and wife. Mary persuaded him to make this video, appealing to his faith in God, and then turned that video over to the military before leaving him once again. In the video, he wears a hoodie, he is clean-shaven, and he is much skinnier than the scruffier and heavier version of himself, whose photo would be splashed across news websites around the world 5 years later. The difference between the two is it looks like two different people. In this particular video, he's like 21, 22. He is 5 years younger. He is clean shaven. He's got a buzz cut for the military. He's got a very narrow face. He's kind of got a baby face a little bit still, maybe a little bit of baby fat. He looks very young. Very, very young. That's not to say that he doesn't look particularly young in the other photo. He just looks more unkempt. But he does look in this particular video kind of like a younger brother to his future self, in terms of, just a completely different person, not the same person who he was, 5 years later. A lot changes in 5 years, apparently. In his confession video, the shooter said, quote, "God gave me a chance to have a life, to have a good life. He gave me every opportunity in the world, and I just dragged him through the mud." Close quote. He also says, quote, "This is not the first mistake, and this is not the last mistake. There's probably plenty to come, unfortunately." Close quote. The video became part of the file in the case against the shooter, a video he made intending to help Mary. As a result of the attack, she lost custody of her son, and she understandably wanted him back. He described what he did and why, blaming it all on being like a 21-year-old kid or 20-year-old kid with a lack of self-control. At one point, he says, quote, "It only takes a few seconds to lose control." Toward the end of the video, the shooter says, quote, "I'm just hoping the day, my last day, whenever that is, whatever date that is, only God can forgive me." The gunman would be ordered to spend 12 months in a Navy prison in San Diego after he was found guilty of the assaults on his wife and stepson. The Air Force doesn't have prisons, I guess, as I understand. I mean, that was in the Secret Service report, that basically he couldn't go to an Air Force prison. They had to send him to a Navy prison. After all of that, Mary was finally able to escape. Everybody clap for Mary. Good for her. The two divorced in October of 2012. When the gunman was released from prison, the Air Force sent him off with a bad conduct discharge in 2014. It's not a dishonorable discharge. It's not good, but it's not a dishonorable discharge. It's worse than a regular discharge, and it's not as bad as a dishonorable discharge. So it looks like he did something wrong, but not enough to put a dishonorable on his record, apparently. Despite his divorce, the perpetrator wouldn't be alone for long after he left the Air Force. First, he moved back home to New Braunfels, and soon enough was in an apartment on his parents' land. They had a barn on their land. They had a little bit of money, as I understand it, and they had a lot of land, and they had a barn, and the barn had an apartment in it, and so he was living there. He started hanging out with this biker gang with a reputation for violence and was trying to become their friend, which probably worked out about as well as you would expect if you saw pictures of him. Again, he had a baby face. He looked like the difference between Noah Wyle, the first episode of ER, and Noah Wyle in The Pit. There's a vast difference between the two, and that is what he looked like. He might have been able to get in later on, but at the time that he left the military, he still would have been younger and more fit and just looked like an infant. I'm sure the biker gang was not interested, or at least it sounds like they weren't interested. He told everyone that Mary lied about him hitting her child. Oh, and he bought another gun, because of course he did. He shouldn't have been able to obtain one given his military convictions, but he got it from a friend, not a gun store, who would have checked his criminal background and not found anything to stop him from getting a weapon. He also reconnected with Annie, the girl he'd physically abused and sexually abused when he'd been 17 and she'd been 13. And then in April of 2014, he and Annie got married. Okay, so I'm getting to a point where there's still a lot left, and I think I've done enough of this story, so I'm going to move on to part 3. I will save any thoughts that I have for the end of that episode, but as it stands, I hope that you all understand just what Mary and now Annie went through at the hands of this man. Like I said, it can be very frustrating looking at a domestic violence situation from the outside if you can't understand that women or the victims in these situations, and they're usually women, that they might have difficulty pulling themselves away from this situation, just because the person who is victimizing them is just giving them these threats and these ultimatums, and doing all sorts of things that make it sound to them as if it might be safer if they go back, at least for their mother or their siblings or their kids or whatever it is that the person who is abusing them is using as a target, as a kind of a whipping boy. Like, if you don't do this, I'm going to hurt this person. And so with Mary, and soon enough with Annie, you have two people who end up getting into this marriage with the future gunman and experiencing a whole lot of abuse. With Annie, you have someone who went through a lot. And I really hope that you all understand that these two women went through just prolonged torture with this man. And even when there are times where you start to question, like, why don't they leave all of that? When it comes to abusive relationships, leaving is the most dangerous time. It's when they decide to do things that are dangerous to the victim and people that they are, their loved ones, their family members, their friends, all of that. So we're finished with this episode, and now it's on to part 3. Thank you guys for listening, and until next time, stay safe.